head down, counter-wiped, and business-minded. That's the survival rule in this city where playing hero gets you killed. But the rule shattered at 2 in the morning when an old woman in a blood-stained Prada coat stumbled into Tess's diner. Tess thought she was merely offering coffee and a dry harbour from the rain, only to wake up and find 4 black SUVs sealing off her street. She hadn't harboured a grandmother. She had sheltered a queen. The espresso machine hissed like a dying lung. It was the only sound left in Frankie's diner, aside from the relentless drum of November rain against the plate glass. Tess dragged a grey rag across the laminate counter, picking up coffee rings and breadcrumbs. It was 2:14 a.m., the kind of hour where the city strips off its polite face and shows you the bone underneath. Her feet ached in cheap sneakers, a dull throb that had long ago become her baseline state of being. She was 24, carrying enough student debt to buy a small island, and operating on 4 hours of sleep. Cynicism wasn't a choice anymore, it was a survival mechanism. The bell above the door chimed. Tess didn't look up immediately. "Grill's closed," she said, pitching her voice loud enough to cut through the hum of the ancient refrigerators. "Coffee and pie only." Nobody answered. She tossed the rag into the sink and turned around. The annoyance on her tongue evaporated. She was standing just inside the threshold, clutching the door handle like it was the only thing keeping her upright. She was in her late 60s, maybe early 70s. Her silver hair was pulled back into an elegant twist, though several strands had escaped and plastered themselves to her wet cheeks. But it was the coat that caught Tess's attention first. A heavy tailored wool trench coat that probably cost more than she made in a year, and the left side of it was soaked in a dark, heavy stain. Blood. The woman let go of the handle and took a step forward. Her knee buckled. Tess vaulted the counter. She didn't think about liability. She didn't think about the neighborhood, or the junkies who sometimes faked injuries to get into the register. You don't fake the sheer, hollow terror in someone's eyes. She caught the woman just before she hit the linoleum. She was surprisingly heavy, dead weight settling into Tess's arms. She smelled like rain, expensive jasmine perfume, and copper. "Hey," Tess said, easing her down to the booth nearest the door. "Hey, look at me. I'm calling an ambulance." Her hand snapped out. Her grip was startlingly strong, her manicured nails digging into Tess's wrist bone. "No." Her voice was a rasp, thick with a heavy Italian accent. "No police, no hospitals. You're bleeding." "It is not mine," she whispered. She squeezed her eyes shut, taking a shallow, ragged breath. "Please, just a moment to sit, just a moment." Tess looked at the blood on the coat, then at her own hands. Clean. The woman was right. She wasn't wounded. She was in shock. Tess pulled her arm away gently. She walked over to the door, flipped the deadbolt, and turned the open sign to closed. She drew the cheap vinyl blinds, shutting out the street lights and the shadows moving in the rain. Then she went to the back room, grabbed a clean thermal blanket Frankie kept for emergencies, and filled a heavy ceramic mug with black tea and 3 packets of sugar. When she got back to the booth, the woman had her elbows on the table, her face buried in her hands. She was shivering. Tess draped the blanket over her shoulders and set the tea down. "Drink it," she told her. "Sugar helps with shock." The woman lowered her hands. Her eyes were dark, calculating, taking in the cheap diner, the cracked vinyl seats, and finally, Tess. She didn't look terrified anymore. She looked like someone who had just survived a shipwreck and was already planning how to build a new boat. "You did not scream," she noted. She picked up the mug with a slight tremor, blowing on the rim. "Screaming doesn't pay the rent," Tess said. She grabbed a napkin and wiped a stray drop of spilled tea off the table. "You want to tell me who bled on you?" "A man who made a very poor decision." She took a sip. Her posture straightened infinitesimally. What is your name, girl? Tess. Tess. She tasted the syllable. I am Rosa. Well, Rosa, I don't know what kind of trouble you're in, and frankly, I don't want to know. But you can't stay here forever. Whoever made that poor decision might have friends. Rosa gave a low, humorless chuckle. They have no friends left. But you are right, Tess. I need to use a telephone, a landline. Tess pointed to the payphone near the restrooms. Takes quarters. I can break $1 if you need it. She didn't need quarters. She walked over, dialing a long string of numbers with the practiced ease of muscle memory. She spoke quietly. Tess didn't try to listen. She went back behind the counter, grabbed a spray bottle of bleach, and started scrubbing the floor where Rosa had first stood, erasing the wet, muddy footprints. You learn to mind your own business in that zip code. 10 minutes later, headlights swept across the drawn blinds. Rosa stood up from the booth. She folded the thermal blanket into a neat square and left it on the table. She reached into her pocket, pulling out a crisp, folded $100 bill and slid it under the sugar dispenser. Keep it, Tess said, leaning against the counter. I don't need a tip for common decency. It is not a tip, Tess, Rosa said softly, adjusting her blood-stained coat as if it were merely a minor inconvenience. It is an apology for the mess. She walked to the door. Tess unlocked it for her. A massive black Lincoln Town car was idling at the curb. The rain was coming down in sheets, but a man in a dark suit was already holding an umbrella over the passenger door. He looked at Tess, his eyes dead and flat, before turning his attention entirely to Rosa. She paused on the threshold and looked back. You have a good head on your shoulders, Tess. Keep it there. She stepped into the rain. The door closed, the lock clicked, and the car melted into the night. Tess locked the door again. She took the $100 bill, stared at Benjamin Franklin's indifferent face, and stuffed it into the tip jar. She finished her shift. She went home. She thought it was over. Daylight in Tess's neighborhood didn't bring warmth. It just highlighted the cracks in the pavement and the garbage the wind blew into the gutters. She woke up at 10 a.m. in a cold sweat, the radiator in her shoebox apartment clanking a rhythmic, obnoxious beat. Her back felt like it had been hit by a truck, a lingering souvenir from the graveyard shift. She dragged herself out of the mattress on the floor, took a lukewarm shower because the boiler was acting up again, and pulled on a clean pair of jeans and a grey sweater. She had a double shift today. The joy of being young, broke, and entirely expendable to the local economy. By 11:30 a.m., Tess was back at Frankie's. The diner looked different in the daylight. Less like a refuge, more like a failing business. Frankie, a man who sweated grease and anxiety in equal measure, was arguing with the meat supplier in the back. Tess tied her apron on and started brewing the first pot of the day shift. The lunch rush was a chaotic blur of burnt toast, demanding truckers, and spilled ketchup. She pushed the memory of Rosa and her blood-stained Prada coat to the back of her mind. It was a weird night. Weird nights happened. You didn't dwell on them unless you wanted to go crazy. It was 2 p.m. when the atmosphere in the diner shifted. It wasn't a sudden noise. It was the absolute absence of it. The low murmur of conversation at the counter died out. A trucker mid-bite of his club sandwich froze. Tess was pouring coffee for a regular at booth 3 when she noticed he was staring out the window, his face suddenly pale. She looked up. 4 identical matte black Cadillac Escalades had just rolled to a stop outside, double parking and blocking the entire street. They didn't honk, they didn't rev their engines, they just sat there, massive and imposing, like iron beasts claiming territory. Tess's stomach dropped. She set the coffee pot down, careful not to spill a drop. The doors of the lead SUV opened. 4 men stepped out onto the wet asphalt. They were massive, their shoulders straining against the fabric of expensive charcoal grey suits. They didn't look like street thugs. They looked corporate, military, and entirely lethal. One had a faint scar running through his eyebrow, another had the flattened nose of a prize fighter. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized efficiency. Frankie came out of the back, wiping his hands on a towel. He saw the cars, saw the men walking toward the door, and actually whimpered. He ducked back into the kitchen. The bell above the door chimed. It sounded much louder than usual. They stepped inside. The diner felt incredibly small all of a sudden. The air seemed to turn to lead. The lead man, the one with the scar, scanned the room. His eyes bypassed the terrified customers and locked onto Tess. He didn't swagger. He walked up to the counter with a calm, unhurried pace. "Tess?" he asked. His voice was deep, gravelly, and polite. She swallowed the dry lump in her throat. She didn't reach for the panic button under the counter. The police wouldn't get there in time, and somehow she knew the police wouldn't touch these guys anyway. "Who's asking?" she said. She hated that her voice trembled on the last syllable. "My name is Matteo," the man said. He didn't smile. "Mr. Russo would like a word with you." "I don't know a Mr. Russo." "You met his mother last night?" Matteo replied. The words were softly spoken, but they hit the room like a gunshot. The regular at booth 3 slid out of his seat and practically sprinted for the back exit. Matteo didn't even look at him. "I'm working," Tess said, crossing her arms over her chest, trying to project a defiance she absolutely did not feel. "I can't just leave." Matteo reached into his inside jacket pocket. Slower than a heartbeat. He pulled out a thick stack of cash, bound by a rubber band, and set it gently on the counter. "For the interruption of business," he said, loud enough for Frankie, who was definitely listening through the kitchen door, to hear. Then Matteo looked back at Tess. His polite demeanor didn't waver, but his eyes grew colder. "Mr. Russo insists, ma'am. Please, it will be much easier if you simply come with us." It wasn't a request. The 3 men by the door shifted their weight. The message was clear. She could walk out on her own 2 feet, or they could carry her out, and they didn't care who got in the way if they had to do the latter. Tess untied her apron. Her hands felt numb. She tossed the apron on the counter next to the stack of cash. "Fine," she said. She walked out from behind the counter. The diner patrons watched her go like she was a dead woman walking. Maybe she was. Matteo gestured toward the door, holding it open for her. She stepped out into the chilly November air and climbed into the back of the second SUV. Matteo slid in beside her, leaving a respectful distance, but close enough that she could smell the faint scent of peppermint and gun oil on him. The doors slammed shut, thick and heavy, cutting off the sounds of the city entirely. The convoy pulled away smoothly. Tess looked out the tinted window, watching her crappy neighborhood roll by, wondering if she would ever see it again. They drove for 40 minutes. They left the cramped, dirty grid of the city, hitting the highway and heading north into the affluent suburbs. The trees got taller, the properties grew larger, and the fences got higher. They eventually turned onto a private road flanked by ancient oak trees. At the end of the drive, a pair of massive wrought iron gates swung open automatically. Beyond them lay an estate that looked less like a house and more like a fortress. Stone walls, slate roof, and manicured lawns that looked like they were trimmed with nail scissors. Men in dark jackets patrolled the perimeter. The SUV purred to a halt in front of a wide stone staircase. Matteo opened her door. "This way, please," he said. Tess stepped out, her cheap sneakers crunching loudly on the crushed gravel driveway. She felt acutely aware of how she looked. Grease-stained jeans, a worn sweater, smelling faintly of old coffee and fryer oil, standing in front of a house that cost more than her entire bloodline would ever earn. She followed Matteo up the steps and through heavy oak double doors. The interior was silent, vast and intimidating. Marble floors, dark wood paneling, and the faint smell of lemon polish and wood smoke. They walked down a long hallway lined with closed doors until Matteo stopped in front of a set of double doors at the very end. He knocked once, opened it, and gestured for her to go inside. He did not follow. The door clicked shut behind her. It was a library. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a massive stone fireplace crackling with a low fire, and a heavy mahogany desk sitting in the center of the room. A man stood by the window, his back to her, looking out at the grounds. He held a crystal glass with an inch of amber liquid in it. He didn't turn around when she entered. "My mother is a difficult woman," he said. His voice was a baritone, smooth but edged with an undeniable authority. "She refuses to accept that she cannot handle matters the way she did 20 years ago." He turned. Dante Russo was not a caricature of a mobster. He wasn't wearing a flashy suit or dripping in gold. He wore a simple, expertly tailored black dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to the forearms, and dark trousers. He looked to be in his early 30s. His face was all sharp angles and hard lines, handsome in a severe, unforgiving way. But what struck her most were his eyes. They were dark, exhausted, and completely assessing. He looked at her the way a jeweler looks at a flaw in a diamond. He walked over to his desk, setting his glass down. He picked up a manila folder. "Tess Harper," he read, flipping a page. 24, nursing school dropout, 6 months behind on your student loans. You work 60 hours a week between Frankie's Diner and a temp agency. No criminal record, no family in the state. He closed the folder and tossed it onto the desk. "You are nobody." Tess crossed her arms. The fear was still there, buzzing in her veins, but the sheer arrogance of the man sparked a flare of anger that burned hotter than the panic. "I prefer independent," she said flatly. Dante's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to people talking back. "Last night my mother was ambushed. 2 of my men were killed. She managed to slip away in the chaos, disoriented, and wandered into your establishment. You hid her. You patched her up. You let her make a call. She was bleeding. And she asked me not to call the cops. Why did you listen to her?" Dante took a step closer, resting his hands on the edge of the desk. He leaned forward, closing the distance between them. "You didn't know who she was. You saw a woman covered in blood. The average citizen panics. The average citizen dials 911. Why didn't you? Because in my neighborhood, dialing 911 usually makes things worse," she answered, keeping her voice level. "She didn't want the cops. She was terrified. She looked like she needed a chair and a minute to breathe. I gave it to her." He studied her face, searching for a lie, a hidden motive, a crack in her composure. She stared right back. She was too tired to put on an act. After a long moment, Dante straightened up. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a thick white envelope. He slid it across the mahogany desk toward her. "The Russo family honors its debts," Dante said, his tone turning businesslike and cold. "There is $50,000 in that envelope, tax-free. It covers your loans, your rent, and buys your absolute, unending silence regarding what you saw last night." Tess looked at the envelope. It was thick. It was heavy. It was a lifeline that would drag her out of the drowning pool she had been treading water in for 5 years. She didn't hesitate. She didn't perform a pantomime of false pride. She walked up to the desk, picked up the envelope, and shoved it into the pocket of her jeans. "Consider me deaf, dumb, and blind," she said. She looked up at him. "Are we done here?" Dante frowned. A microscopic shift in his expression, like a glitch in a machine. He had expected her to refuse, or to cry, or to ask for more. He hadn't expected the transaction to be so utterly transactional. "You take blood money quite easily, Miss Harper. I take rent money easily, Mr. Russo. I don't care whose blood paid for it, as long as it isn't mine." She turned toward the door. "Can your goons drive me back, or do I need to call a cab?" "Matteo will take you," Dante said quietly. She grabbed the doorknob. "Tess!" She stopped, looking back over her shoulder. Dante was standing exactly where she left him, the firelight casting long, harsh shadows across his face. The coldness had cracked, just a fraction, revealing something darker and infinitely more dangerous beneath. "Don't think this makes us even," he said. "You saved her life. I don't forget things like that. If you ever need a favor, you know who I am now." "Let's hope I never need one," she replied. She walked out, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind her, feeling the weight of the envelope against her thigh, and the heavy, suffocating certainty that her life had just irrevocably changed. $50,000 is a strange amount of money. It isn't enough to buy a yacht or disappear to South America, but if you've spent your entire adult life drowning in red ink, it feels like godhood. The first thing Tess did was walk into the local branch of her bank. She sat across from a loan officer named Greg, who had a coffee stain on his tie and the perpetual exhaustion of middle management. When she handed him the cashier's check that cleared her student loans, his eyebrows nearly merged with his hairline. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She just watched him stamp the paperwork and felt a phantom weight lift off her chest. Next was the rent. She paid her landlord 6 months in advance in crisp, unremarkable bills. The rest went into a secure safety deposit box, leaving a modest cushion in her checking account so as not to alert the IRS algorithms. She didn't quit her jobs. Quitting immediately after a Mafia matriarch bleeds in your diner is how you draw attention. Besides, routine is the only anchor you have when the world tilts on its axis. So, she kept wiping down the counters at Frankie's. She kept logging data at the temp agency. She tried to convince herself that Dante Russo and his black SUVs were a bizarre fever dream that she had successfully monetized. The delusion lasted exactly 11 days. It was a Tuesday night. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the city locked in a bitter, dry freeze. Frankie's was dead. The heater was broken again, and Tess was wearing 2 sweaters under her apron. The bell chimed at 11:45 p.m. The man who walked in didn't belong. He wasn't one of Dante's polished enforcers, and he wasn't one of her regular late-night strays. He wore a dirty olive-green surplus jacket, and his boots left heavy mud tracks on the linoleum. He had restless eyes, darting toward the kitchen, the bathrooms, and finally settling on her. "Coffee," he said, taking a stool at the far end of the counter. Tess grabbed a mug and the pot. She poured it black. She slid it across the laminate. $3. He didn't touch his pockets. He stared at the steam rising from the rim. Quiet night. Usually is on a Tuesday. Heard it got loud a couple of weeks back. He wrapped his hands around the mug but didn't lift it. His knuckles were heavily scarred, the skin thick and discolored. Heard an old lady came through here, had a little accident. Tess's heart did a slow, painful roll in her chest. She kept her face blank. She picked up her rag and started wiping a spot on the counter that was already clean. "Lots of people come through here," she said, pitching her voice to a bored, nasal drone. "I don't check IDs. You paying for that coffee or just warming your hands?" He smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "Just asking a question, sweetheart. Word on the street is she made a phone call. I just want to know who she called. Word on the street is usually wrong," she replied. "I work the register. I clean the grease traps. I go home. If somebody made a call, they didn't run it by me." He leaned forward. The smell of stale cigarette smoke and unwashed clothes wafted off him. "See, the people I work for, they don't like loose ends, and they definitely don't like it when someone helps a Russo walk away from a hit. It makes them feel disrespected." Tess stopped wiping the counter. She looked him dead in the eye. "I don't know who Russo is. I don't know who you are. and if you don't put $3 on this counter right now, I'm pressing the panic button under the register and the cops will be here in 4 minutes." It was a bluff. The panic button had been disconnected since 2021. He stared at her for a long, agonizing second. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out a crumpled $5 bill, and tossed it onto the damp counter. "Keep the change, Tess," he said. He didn't drink the coffee. He stood up, turned around, and walked out into the freezing night. Tess stared at the closed door. He knew her name. Dante's men knew her name because they had the resources to find it. This guy knew her name because they had been asking around. The $50,000 in her safety deposit box suddenly didn't feel like a clean slate. It felt like a severance package for her old life. She walked into the back, took off her apron, and found Frankie asleep in his office chair. She shook him awake. "I'm sick," she lied. "I'm throwing up. I have to go." Before he could complain, she grabbed her coat and left through the alley door. She didn't take the main street. She cut through the narrow passageways behind the commercial strip, sticking to the shadows, her keys woven tightly between her knuckles. She was 3 blocks from her apartment when she heard the crunch of gravel behind her. Tess didn't turn around. She picked up her pace. Her apartment building was a brick monolith on the corner of 14th and Elm. If she could make it to the lobby, she had a chance. The streetlights on this stretch were notoriously unreliable, currently emitting a faint, flickering orange glow that barely pierced the darkness. Footsteps echoed against the brick walls, heavy, deliberate, and there were 2 sets. She broke into a jog. They broke into a run. She didn't bother screaming. No one opens their window for a scream on 14th Street. They just double-check their locks. She bolted toward the narrow gap between a boarded-up laundromat and a chain-link fence, hoping to lose them in the maze of dumpsters. A hand clamped down on the shoulder of her coat, jerking her backward with enough force to snap her teeth together. Tess spun, driving her fist, and the keys jutting between her fingers, aiming for the center of the mass in front of her. She connected with something soft. A man grunted sharply, his grip loosening as he stumbled back, clutching his neck. "You bitch!" the second man hissed. It was the guy from the diner. He lunged at her. She tried to pivot, but her cheap sneaker slipped on a patch of black ice. She hit the asphalt hard, the impact jarring the breath from her lungs. Her shoulder screamed in protest. Before she could scramble up, a heavy boot slammed into her ribs. Pain flared, sharp and blinding. She curled inward instinctively, gasping for air that wouldn't come. The man grabbed the front of her coat, hauling her halfway off the ground. His face was inches from hers, his breath hot and foul. "You should have just told me about the call," he spat, raising a fist. She braced for the impact. It never came. There was a muffled thwip. It sounded like a heavy staple gun. The man holding her froze. His eyes widened in a bizarre expression of surprise. A small, perfectly round hole appeared in the center of his forehead. The back of his skull, however, ceased to exist. He dropped her, collapsing backward onto the frozen concrete like a puppet with its strings cut. Tess scrambled backward on her hands and knees, her breath tearing through her throat in ragged sobs. She looked toward the mouth of the alley. Matteo stood under the flickering streetlight. He looked exactly as he had in the diner 2 weeks ago, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, his posture relaxed. His right arm was raised, holding a suppressed handgun. The metal caught the dim light. The first man, the one she had stabbed with her keys, was on his knees, clutching a bleeding puncture wound on his collarbone, staring at Matteo in absolute terror. Matteo didn't speak. He lowered the gun slightly, took 2 measured steps forward, and fired twice into the man's chest. The alley went dead silent. Tess pressed her back against the icy brick of the laundromat, her hands shaking so violently she could barely feel her fingers. There were 2 dead bodies 3 feet away from her. Blood was pooling on the ice, steaming faintly in the cold air. Matteo engaged the safety on his weapon and slid it seamlessly into a shoulder holster hidden beneath his jacket. He walked over to her, stepping carefully over the expanding pool of blood. He crouched down so they were at eye level. His expression was devoid of malice or pity. It was simply professional. "Can you stand, Miss Harper?" he asked. "You—" Tess choked on the word, pointing a trembling finger at the bodies. "You killed them. They were going to beat you to death in an alley to send a message to Mr. Russo." Matteo corrected calmly. "I intervened. Are any of your ribs broken?" Tess pressed a hand to her side, wincing. I don't know, just bruised, I think." He offered his hand. She didn't take it. She grabbed the chain-link fence and hauled herself up, her knees knocking together. She looked at the bodies again and felt a surge of bile rise in her throat. "I have to call the police," she whispered, operating on the last fumes of normal civilian logic. "No," Matteo said. He didn't raise his voice, but the command was absolute. "A cleanup crew is already 2 minutes away. You're not going to be here when they arrive." "I'm going home. Your apartment was breached 20 minutes ago," Matteo informed her, his tone conversational. "They tore it apart looking for you. If you go back there, you will likely encounter the rest of their crew. We need to leave. Now." Her anchor snapped. The safety deposit box, the paid-off loans, the careful routine, all of it was ash. A black SUV idled at the curb just past the alleyway. Matteo stepped aside, gesturing toward it. Tess looked at the bodies, then at her bruised ribs, and finally at Matteo's flat, dead eyes. The $50,000 wasn't a severance package. It was a retainer. She limped out of the alley and got into the car. The Russo estate looked different at 2 in the morning. The imposing stone walls felt less like a display of wealth and more like the perimeter of a high-security prison. Matteo led Tess through a side entrance, bypassing the grand foyer. They went up a narrow, carpeted staircase and down a hallway lined with antique sconces. He opened a door to a massive guest bedroom. It had a king-sized bed, heavy velvet curtains, and an ensuite bathroom that was larger than her entire apartment. "There are fresh clothes in the closet. A physician will be up in 10 minutes to examine your ribs," Matteo said, hovering in the doorway. "Do you require anything else?" "My life back," she said, sitting on the edge of the mattress. She didn't bother hiding the bitterness. Matteo just stared at her. "I will send the doctor up." He closed the door. The lock clicked heavily from the outside. Tess wasn't a guest. She was evidence. She went into the bathroom, stripped off her mud-stained, freezing clothes, and washed her face. She looked in the mirror. She had a scrape on her cheekbone, and a massive, ugly purple bruise was already blossoming along her left rib cage. She found a thick, oversized cashmere sweater and a pair of sweatpants in the closet. They were ridiculously soft. She put them on, hating how comforting they felt. The doctor came and went. He was an older man with a weary face who taped her ribs, left a bottle of prescription painkillers on the nightstand, and didn't ask a single question about how she got hurt. She was sitting in an armchair by the window, staring out at the floodlit grounds, when the door unlocked again. She expected Matteo. She expected Dante. Instead, Rosa walked in. She wasn't wearing a blood-stained Prada coat. She wore a silk dressing gown, her silver hair loose over her shoulders. She looked older than she had in the diner, but her posture was still rigid, with an ingrained authority. She leaned slightly on a silver-tipped cane. She looked at the tape visible through the collar of Tess's sweater, then at her face. "I'm sorry, Tess," she said. Her voice lacked the cold calculation it had in the diner. It was genuine, which somehow made it worse. "Are you?" Tess asked, not moving from the chair. "Or are you just sorry that your mess spilled over onto the hired help?" Rosa didn't flinch at the disrespect. She walked slowly to the edge of the bed and sat down, resting both hands on her cane. In our world, weakness is blood in the water. I was ambushed by the Moretti family. They believed they could cut the head off the snake. When they failed, they panicked. They knew I made a call. They tracked the location to your diner. So they came to kill me because I poured you a cup of tea. They came to interrogate you, and then kill you, yes. Rosa said matter-of-factly, to prove a point, to show that anyone who aids a Russo suffers for it. It is barbaric, but it is the mechanics of our industry. Industry? Tess scoffed. You sound like a CEO. I am a survivor, just as you are. She tilted her head, studying her. Dante placed men on you the moment you left his office, not to watch you, but to protect you. He knew the Morettis might connect the dots. He was right. I don't want his protection. I want him to leave me alone. It is too late for that. A new voice cut in. Dante stood in the open doorway. He had lost the suit jacket, wearing only a white dress shirt, the collar undone, a shoulder holster strapped over his chest. He looked exhausted, the sharp lines of his face drawn tight. Rosa stood up slowly. I will leave you to handle this, Dante. She looked at Tess one last time. Rest, Tess. You are safe here. She walked past Dante, disappearing into the hallway. Dante stepped into the room and closed the door. He didn't lock it this time, but he didn't need to. He walked over to a small mahogany side table, poured a glass of water from a pitcher, and held it out to her. Tess ignored it. He set it on the table beside her chair. Matteo said you handled yourself well in the alley. Dante said, his dark eyes analyzing her battered posture. Most people would have frozen. You fought back. I grew up in foster care and work the graveyard shift on 14th Street. She said flatly, freezing gets you killed. Dante nodded slowly, accepting the data. The Moretti family knows who you are now. They know you survived their men tonight. That makes you an anomaly, and in our business, anomalies are dangerous. If you walk out the front gates of this estate, you will be dead before the sun sets. So what? I just live here now? Tess laughed, a short, sharp sound that sent a spike of pain through her ribs. I become a pet, a hostage. You are a liability, Dante corrected, his voice dropping to that cold, authoritative baritone. You know my mother's face. You know Matteo's face. You know the layout of this estate. And you are currently the focal point of a turf war you have no stake in. I cannot allow you to walk away. Tess stood up, ignoring the burning in her side. She closed the distance between them, tilting her head back to meet his gaze. She was angry enough that the fear burned away completely. I didn't ask for your money. I didn't ask for your protection. I was doing my job. She poked a finger hard against his chest, right over his breastbone. You owe me, Dante. You said it yourself. The Russo family honors its debts. Dante didn't move. He didn't swat her hand away. He just looked down at her, the air between them suddenly thick with a dangerous, unpredictable static. His eyes flicked to her mouth, then back to her eyes. I paid your debt, Tess, he said softly, the gravel in his voice scraping against her nerves. No, you bought my silence. She fired back. Now I'm cashing in my favor. I want a new life, a real one, where I don't have to look over my shoulder for your enemies. Dante stepped closer, forcing her to either step back or hold her ground. She held it, though her breath hitched. He was too large, too intense, too absolute. A new life requires a dead body, fake papers, and a relocation to a place where you speak the language, Dante said, leaning down slightly until they were breathing the same air. I can arrange that, but it takes time. Until then, you stay here. You follow my rules. You do not leave this house. And if I refuse, then I will have Matteo sedate you and tie you to the bed, he said, without a trace of sarcasm. I will not let my mother's savior be gutted in a gutter because of a misplaced sense of independence. You belong to the Russos now, Tess. Until I say otherwise. He turned on his heel and walked to the door. Sleep, he commanded over his shoulder. We have a lot of work to do tomorrow. The door clicked shut. Tess stood in the middle of the lavish, suffocating room, the silence pressing in on her ears. She walked over to the window and looked down at the courtyard. Two men in heavy coats with rifles slung over their shoulders were walking the perimeter. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass. She was alive. She was completely debt-free. And she was utterly, hopelessly trapped. Survival is mostly about momentum. When you stop moving, the reality of your situation catches up to you, and that's usually when the panic sets in. Tess spent the first 3 days in Dante Russo's guest room, trying not to stop moving. She paced the length of the Persian rug until her bruised ribs throbbed in time with her heartbeat. She memorized the titles of the unread leather-bound books on the shelves. She took 4 showers a day just to feel the scalding water mask, the ache in her bones. But by day 4, the momentum died. The sheer oppressive quiet of the estate began to suffocate her. There were no sirens here, no neighbors screaming through thin drywall, just the muffled, rhythmic crunch of gravel as armed men walked their patrol routes outside her window. She was a ghost haunting a luxury suite, living on room service delivered by a stone-faced housekeeper named Carmela, who refused to make eye contact with her. She needed to do something, or she was going to lose her mind. At 6 a.m. on the 5th day, Tess got dressed in the clothes Dante had provided, a heavy grey wool sweater and fitted dark jeans. She opened her bedroom door. The hallway was empty. The morning light was just beginning to filter through the tall windows, casting long, pale shadows across the marble floors. She didn't sneak. She walked down the grand staircase with deliberate steps. If she was going to be a prisoner, she refused to be a polite one. She found the kitchen by following the smell of roasting coffee. It wasn't a standard residential kitchen. It was a sprawling, industrial-grade culinary command center. Stainless steel gleamed under harsh fluorescent lights. A young man with a chef's apron tied around his waist was furiously chopping onions at the center island. He looked up when she walked in. His knife stopped. "You're not supposed to be down here, Miss Harper," he said, his voice tight. "I'm not supposed to be anywhere according to your boss," she replied. She walked over to the massive espresso machine in the corner. It was a beautiful piece of Italian engineering, vastly superior to the hissing junk pile at Frankie's. "Do you have beans in this thing?" Yes, but..." "Great." Tess grabbed a ceramic mug from an overhead rack. "What's your name?" "Leo." "Keep chopping your onions, Leo. I'm just making coffee." She purged the steam wand, packed the portafilter, and pulled a double shot. The familiar, mechanical routine grounded her. The rich, bitter scent filled the air, briefly overpowering the onions. She steamed a small pitcher of milk, feeling the metal heat up against her palm. For 2 minutes, she wasn't collateral damage in a Mafia turf war. She was just a barista on the morning shift. You tamp the grounds too hard. Tess didn't jump, but her hand jerked slightly, spilling a drop of milk on the steel counter. Dante was leaning against the doorframe. He wore a dark grey suit, perfectly tailored, but his tie was loose, and there were dark smudges of exhaustion under his eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept since she arrived. Leo dropped his knife. "Mr. Russo, I told her she wasn't—" "It's fine, Leo," Dante said, his voice quiet but carrying effortlessly across the large room. "Give us a minute." Leo wiped his hands on a towel and practically sprinted out the back door. Dante walked into the kitchen. He stopped next to the center island, watching her pour the steamed milk into the espresso. "My mother has been asking about you. She finds your refusal to eat with us insulting." Tell her I'm used to eating over a sink, Tess said, taking a sip of the coffee. It was the best cup she'd had in years. And I don't like an audience. You are testing the boundaries. I'm making coffee. She set the mug down and leaned against the counter, crossing her arms carefully over her taped ribs. If you wanted me locked in a box, you should have put a deadbolt on the outside of my door. Don't give me ideas. Dante ran a hand over his jaw. The faint rasp of stubble echoed in the quiet room. He walked over to the machine, picked up a spare mug, and poured himself a cup of black drip coffee from the side carafe. He didn't look like a crime boss in that exact moment. He just looked like a deeply tired man. The Moretti family is getting desperate, Dante said, staring down into his black coffee. They lost 2 men in the alley. They lost a shipment of firearms last night at the docks. My men intercepted it. Why are you telling me this? Because you are involved, whether you want to be or not. He finally looked at her. The harsh kitchen lights caught the amber flecks in his dark eyes. They know you are here. They have informants. They know I brought a civilian into my home. In our world, taking in an outsider is a vulnerability. They will try to exploit it. So I'm bait. No, you are a guest under my protection. Dante's jaw tightened. I do not use innocent people as bait, Tess. I'm not innocent, Dante. I'm just broke. There's a difference. She picked up her mug. How long until this new life of mine is ready? Because frankly, I'd rather take my chances in a foreign country than wait around here for a sniper bullet. 3 days, Dante said flatly. The papers are being finalized. A passport, a social security number, a bank account in Toronto with enough funds to start over. 3 days, and you are free to go. The words should have brought relief. Instead, a cold, heavy rock settled in her stomach. 3 days. Good, she lied, keeping her face blank. I need to pack. You brought nothing with you. Exactly, it'll be a quick process. She walked past him toward the door. As she brushed by his shoulder, he shifted slightly, blocking her path. They were inches apart. She could smell the sharp, clean scent of his soap, mixed with the faint, metallic tang of coffee. You act as though you feel nothing, Dante murmured, looking down at her. But you fought like hell in that alley. You want to survive. Why pretend you don't care? Because caring is a luxury for people who can afford to lose things, she said, meeting his gaze evenly. I can't, so I don't. She stepped around him and walked back up to her gold-plated cage. The illusion of safety shattered on a Thursday night. It was raining again, the kind of heavy, relentless downpour that turned the estate grounds into a muddy swamp and washed out the security cameras. Tess was sitting by her bedroom window, watching the water streak the glass, trying not to think about Toronto. At 11:14 p.m. the lights went out. Not just a flicker. The entire estate plunged into absolute, crushing darkness. Before her eyes could adjust, the concussive boom of an explosion rattled the window pane, sending a vibration straight up her spine. It came from the front gates. She threw herself off the chair, hitting the floor right as a burst of automatic gunfire tore through the night air. The heavy thud of bullets hitting stone echoed across the courtyard. She didn't scream. She crawled over the thick carpet to the heavy oak door and locked the deadbolt. Then she dragged the solid wood nightstand across the floor and wedged it under the handle. She didn't know if it would stop a bullet, but it might buy her 10 seconds. The gunfire was erratic at first, then stabilized into controlled, rhythmic bursts. Dante's men were returning fire. Tess sat with her back against the wall, pulling her knees to her chest, protecting her bruised ribs. Her nursing school training, the tiny shred of it she retained, kicked in, burying the panic under a cold, analytical focus. They hit the power. They hit the gates. It was a coordinated breach. Footsteps pounded down the hallway outside. heavy boots. Someone hammered on her door. "Tess, open the door!" It was Matteo. She shoved the nightstand aside and flipped the deadbolt. Matteo pushed into the room. In the dim ambient light from the window, she could see his face was smeared with rain and dirt. He was holding a compact assault rifle, and his left arm was hanging limply at his side. Dark blood soaked the sleeve of his grey suit. "We are moving," he ordered, his breathing heavy but controlled. "The front gate is gone. They are pushing the perimeter. We are falling back to the basement bunker. You're hit," she said, pointing at his arm. "It's a through and through. Doesn't matter. Move." He grabbed her wrist with his good hand and pulled her into the dark hallway. Emergency red lighting flickered on, casting everything in a blood-colored glow. The house was alive with chaos. Men shouted orders in Italian. More gunfire echoed from the lower levels. They made it to the top of the grand staircase. Below them, the foyer was a war zone. The heavy front doors had been blown off their hinges. Rain and wind whipped into the house. 3 of Dante's men were crouched behind the marble pillars, firing out into the darkness. She saw Dante. He was standing behind the overturned dining room table, a rifle pressed to his shoulder, firing precise, methodical shots. He wasn't yelling. He was a machine, calculating and lethal. Suddenly, one of the men by the pillar, a young guard Tess had seen patrolling the gardens, jerked violently backward. He hit the marble floor, screaming, clutching his thigh. A dark pool immediately began spreading out from under his fingers. Femoral artery. If he didn't get pressure on it in 60 seconds, he was going to bleed out on the floor. "Matteo, cover me!" Tess yelled over the noise. Before Matteo could stop her, she ripped her arm out of his grip and sprinted down the staircase. "Tess, get back here!" Dante roared from across the room. She ignored him. She hit the foyer floor and slid the last 5 feet on her knees across the slick marble, coming to a halt behind the pillar next to the screaming guard. The noise down here was deafening. Bullets chipped the stone above their heads, showering them in white dust. The guard's face was chalk white. His hands were slipping on his own blood. "Let go," she told him, prying his fingers away. She looked at the wound. It was high on the thigh, pumping bright red blood in rhythmic spurts. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady. She grabbed the thick fabric of his tactical pants and ripped the tear wider. She needed a tourniquet. She didn't have one. She looked around frantically. She grabbed the heavy silk tie from the collar of a dead Moretti soldier lying a few feet away. She looped it high and tight around the guard's upper thigh, pulling the knot with every ounce of strength she had. The guard screamed, a raw, guttural sound. I know," she muttered, grabbing a heavy brass candlestick from the debris on the floor. She slipped it under the knot and began twisting it like a windlass, ratcheting the pressure down until the silk dug deep into his muscle. The spurting blood slowed. Then it stopped. "Hold this," she commanded the guard, forcing his shaking hands over the candlestick. "Do not let it unspool. If you let it go, you die. Understand?" He nodded frantically, tears cutting tracks through the dust on his face. Suddenly, a hand clamped down on the back of her sweater, hauling her roughly to her feet. She spun around, ready to fight, and found herself face to face with Dante. His eyes were wild, completely stripped of their usual cold control. He didn't say a word. He grabbed her by the waist, threw her over his shoulder like a sack of grain, and sprinted for the door leading to the basement stairs. They hit the heavy steel door of the bunker. Matteo was already there, holding it open. Dante tossed her inside, dragged the wounded guard in right behind her, and slammed the reinforced steel shut. The heavy locking mechanisms engaged with a deafening clank. The sound of the firefight vanished, replaced by the humming of a backup generator. Tess collapsed onto a cot against the concrete wall, gasping for air. Her hands were coated in sticky, drying blood. Her ribs felt like they had been hit with a sledgehammer. Dante dropped his rifle on a metal table. He walked over to her in 3 long strides. He grabbed her shoulders, pulling her upright, his grip bruising. "Are you insane?" he demanded, his voice echoing in the small concrete room. "You ran into crossfire. You could have been cut in half." "He was bleeding out!" she yelled back, the adrenaline finally breaking through her cynical shell, leaving her shaking violently. "His femoral artery was hit. I had to stop the bleeding." "You are not my medic. You are a civilian!" Dante's hands tightened on her shoulders. He was breathing heavily, his face inches from hers. For the first time since she met him, he looked genuinely terrified. "If you had died on that floor—" He stopped. He stared at her, looking at the blood on her hands, the dust in her hair, the defiance in her eyes. Slowly, the anger drained out of his expression, replaced by something heavier and far more complicated. He didn't let go of her shoulders. His thumbs traced a small, unconscious circle against her collarbone. "You don't listen to anyone, do you?" he whispered. "I listen to reality," she whispered back, her voice trembling. And reality said he was dying. Dante stared at her mouth for a long, heavy second. The air in the bunker felt suddenly too thin to breathe. Then he let her go, taking a step back, the invisible wall slamming back into place between them. "Patch up, Matteo," he ordered roughly, turning his back to her. "We stay in here until the cleanup crew signals the all clear." Tess looked down at her shaking, blood-stained hands. The gold-plated cage was gone. She was in the trenches now, and she wasn't sure she wanted to climb out. The estate smelled like bleach, ozone, and copper for 3 days. No matter how much industrial cleaner the housekeeping staff used, the ghost of the firefight clung to the heavy velvet curtains and the marble floors. The Moretti assault had failed, but the illusion of absolute safety within these stone walls was permanently shattered. The Russo machine simply adapted. Bullet holes were plastered. Blood was scrubbed. Men in darker suits carrying heavier rifles replaced the ones who didn't make it through the night. On the third morning, Tess was sitting in the library. The fire was roaring in the massive stone hearth, fighting the damp November chill seeping through the window panes. She had a heavy, leather-bound book open on her lap, but she hadn't turned a page in an hour. Her taped ribs throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. She was staring at the flames, thinking about the guard whose life she had tied off with a piece of silk, and the cold, terrifying clarity she felt while doing it. The heavy oak doors clicked open. Dante walked in. He moved with his usual, measured, predatory grace, but the events of the week had carved deeper, harsher lines around his mouth. He wore a black suit, no tie, the top 2 buttons of his shirt undone. He held a thick, brown leather folio in his left hand. He didn't say a word as he crossed the Persian rug. He simply walked over to the armchair opposite hers, sat down, and tossed the folio onto the low mahogany table between them. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud. "It's done," Dante said. His voice was a flat, gravelly rasp. Tess looked at the folder. It looked remarkably harmless for something that was supposed to erase 24 years of her existence. Inside is a Canadian passport, a driver's license, a birth certificate, and a social insurance number, Dante explained, his tone completely devoid of emotion, like he was reading a shipping manifest. "Your new name is Sarah Jenkins. There is a secure debit card linked to an account holding $200,000. The property deed to a small, discreet apartment in downtown Toronto is in the back pocket." Tess stared at the leather folder. The silence in the library stretched, pulling taut until it felt like a physical weight pressing against her chest. "$200,000? She finally asked, her voice dry. "The original deal was 50. Consider the remainder hazard pay for having to tie a tourniquet under heavy fire." Dante replied evenly. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, clasping his hands together. A car is idling at the back entrance. It will take you to a private airfield. You will be in Canada by tonight. The Morettis will never find you. You are free, Tess. This was it. The emergency exit. The clean slate she had thought she bought with the very first envelope of cash. She could walk out of this fortress, leave the blood and the guns and the dead-eyed enforcers behind. She could become Sarah Jenkins. She could go back to a quiet, boring, intensely safe life. She reached out and placed her hand flat on the leather folio. The material was cold. "And what happens to you?" she asked, looking up from the table to meet his eyes. Dante's jaw tightened. "That is not your concern. You are leaving the board." "What happens to you, Dante?" she repeated. He held her gaze, his dark eyes unreadable. "We go to war. The Morettis overstepped. I will dismantle their entire operation, street by street, until there is nothing left but ash. It will be violent. It will be ugly. And you will be 3,000 miles away from it. And after the war? When you win? Or when you lose?" "I don't lose. Everyone loses eventually," she countered softly. She pulled her hand back from the folio. She looked at this man, a ruthless, calculating criminal who had kidnapped her, paid her off, and then dragged her to safety through a hail of bullets. She thought about the cold, lonely apartment in Toronto. She thought about pretending to be a woman who hadn't seen two men executed in an icy alleyway. She thought about living the rest of her life scanning crowds, jumping at shadows, wondering if her safety was just a clerical error the Mafia hadn't corrected yet, wondering if Dante Russo was alive or buried in a closed casket. Cynicism is a survival mechanism, but so is knowing when to stop running. "Toronto is miserable this time of year," she said. Dante froze. He stared at her, his eyes searching her face for the punchline, for the trick. He found nothing but dead resolve. "Tess," he said, a low warning vibrating in the syllables. "Do not play games. I am offering you the door. If you don't walk through it right now, it locks behind you forever. You saw what happened 2 nights ago. That is my reality. It does not get cleaner. It does not get safer." "I know." Tess picked up the leather folio. She didn't bother opening it. She stood up, ignoring the sharp protest of her bruised ribs, and walked over to the massive stone fireplace. The flames licked hungrily at the thick oak logs. "What are you doing?" Dante asked. He stood up slowly. "Making a choice," she said. She tossed the folio directly into the fire. The heavy leather hit the embers with a muted thump. For a split second, nothing happened. Then the edges curled and caught. The fake passport, the new name, the safe, boring life. It all went up in a bright, sudden flare of orange heat. She turned back to face him. Dante was staring at the fire, a look of absolute, stunned disbelief fracturing his features. The mask was entirely gone. The cold Mafia boss had vanished, leaving only a man watching his carefully constructed plan burn to cinders. He slowly turned his head to look at her. The air in the room crackled with a sudden, violent energy. "Are you completely out of your mind?" He breathed, closing the distance between them in 3 long strides. "Probably," she admitted, standing her ground as he stopped inches away. "But I realize something. If I go to Toronto, I'll spend every day looking over my shoulder. Staying here means I know exactly where the monsters are. I'm not a civilian anymore. You made sure of that. And I am done running." Dante stared at her, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. "You have no idea what you just tied yourself to. I know exactly what I tied myself to," she replied, her voice rock steady. "A debt. You owe me, Dante." "And what do you want to collect?" he asked, leaning in. "A seat at the table. I'm not a guest anymore. If I'm going to live in a war zone, I'm going to learn how to shoot back." A slow, dark smirk spread across Dante's face. He raised a hand, his thumb gently tracing her jawline, feeling her frantic, undeniable pulse. "You are entirely too brave for your own good." He murmured, "I accept the terms." The gold-plated cage was gone. She wasn't just collateral damage anymore. She was the bullet. Tess didn't just survive the Mafia. She demanded a seat at their table. If her choice to burn that passport and step into the fire gave you chills, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Would you have taken the money and run to a safe, quiet life in Toronto, or stayed to fight alongside Dante? Drop your answer in the comments below. Don't forget to share this video with anyone who loves a gritty, slow-burn romance with a fierce, unapologetic heroine, and ring the notification bell so you never miss our next dark drama